Hello, and a good morning or a good afternoon or a good evening, wherever you are in the world, and join this webcast window on at the conference board. My name is Bart van Ark, Chief Economist at the conference board, and today we have a special version of our virtual panel. And that special edition is going to be on the midterm elections that happened yesterday. So we're hot off the press here, the kind of morning after feeling about what does this all mean. We had these elections yesterday. Every election in the US, frankly, feels like a historic event. But this one perhaps even a little bit more because of the general feeling that this was really a kind of an assessment on what the voters and the electorate thought about the first 2 years of the administration of President Trump, and also the new approach to policy and policy making that this administration has been taking. So it's been very interesting. The results are still rolling in. They're still not quite definitive. We'll be talking a little bit about that also during the webcast. But more specifically today, we're going to do basically four things. First of all, we'll have a very quick review of last night's results. What do we know by right now? What are the most important insights? Some of it you may have picked up from the media, but we try to add some more meat on the bones there. Secondly, we're going to take a very high-level view. What are the implications of these kind of elections for not just the U.S. political environment, but also for the business environment in the United States and perhaps even globally? And then we'll take a deep dive into two more specific policy topics that are very relevant for the business sector. First of all, the impact on fiscal policy, whether this is spending, including infrastructure, for example, which is probably an important area to discuss, revenue, in terms of taxes, but also what are the impacts of this going to be on the deficit and on the evolution of the debt, the government debt in the United States. And then finally, we'll address other major business topics, of course, the regulatory environment, which is critical, but also what is happening to trade policy, and could we see anything happening there in terms of changes compared to the current path, healthcare, education, and what other topics may perhaps come up. And for this, of course, I'm joined by an excellent panel today. Today we have an entire in-house panel, and that is because we can really benefit from two of our colleagues at the Committee for Economic Development at the Conference Board. First of all, we have in the studio in New York, Bernard Bailey. Bernard is the president of the Committee for Economic Development. First on this virtual panel. Great to have you on,
My
Bernard.
pleasure.
Welcome.
It's great to be here on this very historical morning. Thank you.
Absolutely. And in our studio in DC at the Committee for Economic Development is Mike Petro, and Mike is the Executive Vice President of Economic Development. Mike, it's great to have you here too.
Oh, Bart, it's great to be here. I lost some sleep last night. I only had about 3 hours of sleep, so I hope I don't seem too groggy during this discussion.
Well, you didn't miss a beat apparently, so we really need to have you here. And I'm not sure about Brian Shaitkin in the studio in New York. Brian, did you sleep at all last night, or you just went for
I actually
the morning?
slept quite a lot. I mean, the general contours of the outcome were known early on. But what we're going to do on this program is describe what gridlock means from the economic and business environment. So if you're interested in that, please stay tuned.
Stay on. Very great to have you on, Brian, as always. Okay, just very quickly, and you'll see this is on the screen. You can participate if you earn CPE credits. Make sure then you type your full name and email address, which will be provided during the webcast. Click OK, stay online, and credits, of course, only available on the live webcast. And there's some other guidelines for making maximum use. The most important that I really want to mention is that you can ask questions. This is a virtual panel discussion, but you are part of the virtual environment. So do put in your questions anytime. We'll get them here on our screen, and we can weave them in during the discussion. And we also like you actually to participate right away. And in our first section, or we're going to talk about what actually happened last night. We're going to ask you what you actually think happened last night. And for that, the first poll question should be appearing on the screen, and it does right now. And that is, from a nationwide perspective, the results from last night's elections are a consolidation of the current administration's policy, a significant challenge to the current administration policy, or a continued policy paralysis and a dividedness. Are we moving forward with the current administration policy? Are we being challenged, or is it actually even more paralysis and dividedness of what we have been before? And this is your chance to respond, and votes are still coming in. And after that, I'll ask each of my panel's members, starting with Bernard and Brian in the studio, and then Mike, to give a very quick first reaction. So 5 more seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and we close it down. So a pretty clear majority, a very clear majority, I would say, that this is an environment of continued policy paralysis and dividedness. Bernard, let me start with you. Would you also have voted for 3, or would you have picked one of the others?
You know, I think certainly 3 is the most logical response here, given what we've seen happen. I mean, we've been in this state of paralysis now within this country for, you know, depending upon when you want to start the clock, anywhere from 12 years forward. So it's not unusual that we continue here, and it's really a clear representation of the polarization that exists here within the United States between both red and blue, and there are clearly a couple of defining issues. I think when you look at it on the blue side, that healthcare is the defining issue there, and when you look at it on the red side, draining the swamp and reducing government and the economy foremost are really what drive voters off on the red side. So we continue with that paralysis.
So we'll pick up some of those topics that you just mentioned during the webcast. Brian, also on vote 3, and perhaps also surprising that perhaps not more people picked number 2, given the fact that the Democrats made some wins.
I agree, though, with our audience that 3 is the most logical choice. The outcome with Republicans gaining in the Senate, Democrats winning control of the House, is the one that will make deal-making the most difficult and will make major legislation the most difficult.
Mike, are we all aligned?
No, I'm going to differ. I think all 3, and I know you're not allowed to vote for all 3. But what I would say is that the president consolidated his base and his policies in the more rural areas. I think the results in Florida are very significant. And I think the Democrats winning the House with largely moderate women is significant as well. I do think it's going to lead to gridlock. I think that'll be the ultimate result, but I don't think we should underestimate how well the president and how well moderate Democrats did last night.
Yeah. So yeah, actually that's a very thoughtful comment, and indeed when we talk about it a little later what this is on the political landscape, we'll come back to that. But before that, Brian, just give us a brief account of what happened last night.
So in terms of thinking about the scope for deal making, I think it's important to remind our non-US audience how legislation is passed through Congress. So what would be required for most laws is 60 votes in the Senate, a majority in the House of Representatives, and then, of course, the approval of the executive. There are some exceptions. The Senate alone has the ability to approve judicial and presidential nominees with 50 votes. The House and Senate both have the ability to engage in their own investigations and have subpoena power to do so. But generally, for most of the legislation we'll be talking about, that is the framework to think about. So what happened last night? Well, first of all, Republicans will have gained between 2 and 4 seats, mostly in actually entirely in rural states that President Trump won back in 2016. Democrats won a majority in the House as a result of their strength, primarily in suburban and urban districts. And I think that delineation is very important to think about, because increasingly there are, as Bernard said, you have a huge increase in terms of polarization. You have 2 distinct visions and constituencies in terms of how national policy is carried out. Democrats representing a more urban and suburban constituency with priorities reflecting those. Republicans tending to represent areas with less dense population bases. And so it's very, very difficult as a result to coordinate policy across those areas. And I think what we also saw and what we're seeing increasingly is a decoupling between the overall results of popular support between the two parties. So Democrats will have won by about an 8-point popular vote margin in the House of Representatives by the time all votes are counted. But had they won by only 4 or 5 points, it's very likely that Republicans would have maintained control of the House. So we have an increasingly polarized environment. I think an environment that's tending towards less stability than has been the tradition of US politics. And so it creates not only a more difficult deal-making environment simply because any piece of legislation requires the president, several Republican senators, and also the House of Representatives to join in making that deal, but also just a furthering of the polarization that we've seen over the last 2 years, a sense where both parties are claiming victory, and probably not only a more difficult environment in terms of getting legislation done, but one where political tensions are going to play more of a role, not just in shaping legislation, but also shaping business outcomes and business strategy.
Right. So Bernard, let's go to you, because I think what Brian is saying, and in fact, Mike said it earlier too, there are actually multiple winners. Everybody's claiming victory. Are there no losers in this election?
Well, let's start by saying the big winner, let me say the big winner really was democracy. We had 113 million people get out and vote, so we had a tremendously engaged electorate here in the United States. If we looked at the previous midterm election, it was only 83 million voters. So the good news is democracy is a big winner in this election here in the United States. And I think we should all really be excited and take strength in that. So let's start there. Now, are there some losers? Well, it'll be interesting to see how this plays out. And the reason I say that, I think the one kind of wild card in all of this is, how does President Trump choose to play this? All right, because it's kind of interesting. If you look at his policies, they didn't follow what would be traditional strict Republican or red lines, right? His positions on trade policy were not really consistent with what most Republicans feel. His fiscal responsibility, fiscal policies weren't necessarily aligned with traditional Republicans. His desire to spend more money on infrastructure, these are all policies that frankly are supported more by a blue or Democratic electorate. So will he reach across the aisle now and try to bring some of these policies forward in this environment? I think we need to see what's going to happen there. At the same time, though, there's certainly a lot of resistance on some of the other policies where he aligns more with Republicans, particularly in the areas of infrastructure, particularly in the area of immigration, which is still a huge question mark out there in terms of how that's going to get played out. And not to mention, what was rumbled very, very heavily before this election, which are additional tax cuts. So I think this whole thing goes up in the air, and it's going to be very, very interesting as we play it out. But I think, the bottom line, I think we should all feel really good about the level of engagement across the country in the democratic process, and that's important.
I agree. People were definitely fired up, and for some good reasons, perhaps also for some reasons not so good. But I agree. The more people come to the ballot box, the better it is. Mike, I think one thing that Bernard said that's very interesting is, it's up to the president now to see if there's opportunity, reach out to Congress and get policy done. How much interest is there actually in this new Congress to actually get policy done?
Well, I think, Nancy Pelosi has said from the outset that impeaching the president was not on her agenda. And I think that's a helpful first step forward, because there's a lot of people in her caucus that think otherwise. So I do think that there will be an initial, reaching across the aisle and trying to get things done. Let me talk about two of the winners last night, though. I think Nancy Pelosi and the president were winners. Nancy Pelosi, her decision to focus on health care as a political strategy helped the Democrats win the House back, and I think that's clear. President Trump, his decision not to focus on the economy, but to focus on immigration against the advice of Speaker Ryan, has proved to be very helpful. So I think those two people, President Nancy Pelosi, by the way, has probably sealed her effort to be Speaker once again on that decision. On the losers, I would say the rock star Democrats that everyone was excited about, Beto O'Rourke in Texas, Andrew Gillum in Florida. These were people that Democrats were hopeful. They didn't fare well, and I think that's bad news for the Democrats. On the Republican side, this Virginia 8th District, the district in suburban Richmond, which has been very conservative, that went to a moderate Democrat woman, and that was a loss for the Republicans. So I think Republicans have to look at that and be concerned. So I say, overall, as we've discussed, a mixed night, winners and losers.
Yeah, great. So those are good comments. So let's step a little bit backward or forward. Let's look a little bit beyond the current elections of last night. And Bernard, let me start with you by basically asking, what does this election tell us about the current state of U.S. politics, about our ability to get things done? And indeed, is there a chance, I sort of repeating that question, is there a chance that more things will get done over the next 2 years than in the past 2 years? And then, of course, more specifically, how does this current political environment influence our business?
Well, first of all, I think, actions scream so loud, it's very difficult to listen to the words of what a lot of these politicians said throughout the election process, right? So having said that, we've been stuck in this gridlock. Our ability to get a lot done, even when we had, an all-red Congress and executive branch, we didn't get a ton done. So I think it's very difficult to be overly optimistic that a lot's going to get done. At the same time, when we look at the regulatory environment, I think that's an interesting area because that is still under the control of the executive branch. That's been a major boom in helping the economy to get moving, and I think.
But let me interrupt you for a second, Bernard, just to challenge, just for the sake of argument. You said there's not a ton of stuff done. We had a major tax cut, or some people would even call it a tax reform. We pulled back the healthcare law partially, but we did. There's been a lot of deregulation. So from a business perspective, could we really argue that very little has gone done in the last 2 years, and is there a chance of more or less getting done in the next?
Well, I think that's fair. I guess when I say a lot getting done, I really go back to a lot of the promises that were put in place in terms of draining the swamp, in terms of getting the wall built, in terms of immigration, in terms of repealing health care. So, yeah, let me back up a little on my comments. First of all, I think President Trump and his administration got more done in the last 2 years than almost any president has in their first 2 years in modern history. So, especially from a business perspective. I think he's got a lot done, especially in terms of the things that he had control over, which is on the executive branch, particularly around the regulatory environment. So a lot has been done there, and I think we'll continue to see those types of things done. But I think in terms of now seeing further tax initiatives get done, to see an infrastructure bill get done, to see healthcare continue to move forward, I think that's up in question whether that's going to be able to happen, whether he can get the requisite support from the Senate in the same way.
Mike, any thoughts from your side, from a bigger perspective? What does this all mean?
Well, I actually think that divided government may be good for business. I think with the economy humming as it is, I think the idea of do no harm might be something beneficial to the economy and to the business community. The concern about another tax cut driving up our fiscal health of our nation probably won't happen in this divided government. Now, I will say the caution here is that if divided government starts shutting down the government, for instance, and it starts creating a unpredictable, uncertain environment, obviously that's going to have some repercussions. I will say on the more shorter end of things, if I may, it's historic that the market during the midterm elections take a hit, and of course we've seen that in the month of October. Not just because of the midterm elections. There's other other reasons for why the market hit the way it did, but it did go down, and that has been an historic development. Look out for what many call the relief rally, which is once the dust settles and there's less uncertainty, the market will rally, and that has been throughout these midterms something that has happened on a regular basis.
Let me challenge you a little, though. I get your point on divided government sometimes is okay. Particularly when an economy is doing well, it doesn't stand in the way. But particularly from a sort of medium long-term perspective, policy needs to be forward-looking and needs to create conditions for better growth performance, because the economy isn't going to hum on its own forever. We need to manage risks and those kind of things. And has the current administration been doing that sufficiently? And is Congress in its new constitution able to actually be part of that process?
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree with you more. I think for the long term, we need some bipartisan approaches, especially when it comes to infrastructure and healthcare. But if you're looking at a silver lining to nothing getting done, the do no harm lining, I think, is one to focus on, because I do think the economy is performing so well, and you don't want to mess up the system and kind of deride some of the progress we've had.
I would just like to chime in, though, there, Bart, if you don't mind. And I agree. Do no harm, certainly in the short run, given how well our economy is functioning today, is really important. But as a nation, we are facing some serious issues that are a tsunami well in front of us that we are going to hit into. Our budget deficit is right at the front of that. So when we look at an ability to really deal with that problem, that's a problem that has to be met, and it has to be met by in a bipartisan way. So I think it's extremely important that 113 million Americans didn't show up to vote for a bunch of people who aren't going to get anything done. They expect to see Washington step up and start to solve some of these really tough problems. And in the long-range interest of the United States, that's absolutely critical going forward. And we have to start now.
Yeah. I think that's a good point. Brian, any additional thoughts? I also want to throw one question at you that came in through the chat box. I'd encourage other people also to put in questions in the chat box. And that is, what happened to the Tea Party? Is it still there? Maybe you can take that on board in your comments.
Understanding what happened to the Tea Party, I think there are sort of two possible interpretations. One is that there was very much a libertarian streak to a lot of early Tea Party supporters, which has definitely diminished in present administration policy to a much lesser extent in Congress, sort of much less concern about fiscal restraint and sort of managing budgets, the tax cut being a prime example of that. But on the other hand, the rhetorical approach of the Tea Party, sort of a very direct confrontational form of messaging, that has obviously been continued to be picked up. And I think that's led to a major increase in the degree of polarization. I think it dovetails well with what Bernard was saying about the need of Congress to be able to do something, because as well as the economy is doing, the fact is that capital and labor resources are being increasingly stretched. It has been a long time since the last recession. There is very much a non-zero probability that sometime in these next 2 years, the U.S. will face a serious economic crisis. We don't exactly know what the origin is going to be. And in dealing with the last financial crisis, you saw an amazing amount of cooperation across two administrations of different parties and different political philosophies. And the question is, in this current rhetorical environment, is that kind of cooperation going to be there in order to deal with potential crises that may take hold in the next 2 years?
Yeah, it's not just policies that need to look forward and like education, healthcare, but also crisis management needs to be solid, and you want to have a workable political apparatus for that. That's a really good point. I want to use the remainder of our time to really now deep dive a little bit into two topic areas. So let's start with fiscal policy. And let's start with another poll question. The second poll question is going to come up now. And that's where we're asking you the most important impact of fiscal policy from last night's midterm election will come from further fiscal expansion for increased spending. Is that the major effect that you will see looking at last night's votes? Further fiscal expansion through an extension of tax cuts, both, or a gradual return to fiscal restraint? Think a little bit about this. Do you think it will be more spending, more tax cuts, both, or actually a little bit of a return to more fiscal restraint? And after that, Brian, I'm going to ask you to basically talk to us first about what you think the biggest fiscal policy effects are going to be in the next 2 years, and then of course Bernard will ask for their views too. So we'll leave it open a little bit more, a little harder question than the first one, morning after. So we give it 5 more seconds. 5, 4, 3, 1, and we'll close it now. Naturally, I'm interested about this because I had not expected that half of actually say that I see a return to fiscal restraint. So, Brian, help me think through. Why do we think that this might actually be a situation where we can see more?
So, on the one hand, administrations tend to pass their signature economic program in those first 2 years, especially in the case of the Obama administration, the Trump administration, where you have unified control of Congress during that period. And so that allowed for the Obama administration to pass the stimulus and also the Affordable Care Act. In the case of the Trump administration, that means the tax cuts and some of the regulatory changes that Bernard spoke about earlier. And so there's much less opportunity, especially after a midterm in which one of the houses changes over in terms of control, for big fiscal programs to be passed. And that's especially true when the two houses are divided as well, so that President Trump might be interested in making a deal on infrastructure, but he'd have to make that deal not only with House Democrats who might be interested in taking more of a government spending approach to infrastructure, but also Senate Republicans who, if there was any infrastructure spending, would take more of a public-private partnership approach and would be much more hesitant to engage in general in non-discretionary spending. So I think it's going to be much more difficult to pass an infrastructure program, and it's going to be much more difficult to pass further tax cuts. You may very well see in the process of negotiating a budget some modest increase in government spending, but it's not going to be, I think, comparable with what happened last year, especially given that Treasury interest rates are now much higher. I think what could concentrate minds in all three stakeholders is if there is a recession, if there is a crisis. And in fact, the way these parties might think about infrastructure is as a prophylactic against a future recession. A program where priorities could be defined, thinking about the next generation of infrastructure that would be needed to boost productivity growth. What types of wireless networks would be needed? What types of technological investments might be useful, and sort of what types of surface and rail transportation would help bring about faster productivity growth, and then to wait to basically set the legislation in such a way that the spending would commence at such time when there is more underutilized labor resources available, i.e., a period of recession or economic slowdown, when those resources could be more productively employed building some of this infrastructure.
So Bernard, at some point the president said, he wants to give another 10% tax cut to the middle class. That perhaps seems less likely now to get done. But could he perhaps find an alliance with Democrats in Congress, in the House in particular, to speed up infrastructure spending?
Well, yeah, and that's exactly what I'm afraid of. I think everything Brian says makes so much good sense. But unfortunately, my big concern here obviously is that we have a Congress now that likes to spend and wants to spend. And at the same time, we have a president who likes to spend and wants to spend. And he also wants to cut taxes. I think the only saving grace we have in all of this, and I think Brian articulated it well earlier, is that hopefully we have a Senate that can act in check here. But I can't be very optimistic about any type of fiscal restraint. And I'll tell you, we're at a point where we talk about crises going forward, and we are really losing all of our bullets to be able to solve any fiscal crisis or any type of crisis this country might hit. Not only on the fiscal side, but also on the monetary side. So it'll be interesting. I just don't see the appetite from either the administration or from Congress to do anything. And help us, I hope that the Senate will step up.
So you don't quite agree with the half of the voters here on this poll who said that they think a return to fiscal restraint may happen. You think it's just...
Yeah, I want to agree with them, believe me. Oh, I'd love to believe with them, but no, I just don't see that the electorate got elected with any mandate for fiscal constraint, and quite the contrary, I think. Right. There's still a desire for lots of government programs within Congress, which is unfortunate, I think, for America.
But what about the infrastructure? We do need better infrastructure still, right? So I obviously, as an economist, I cannot agree more with you about fiscal restraint that is necessary. But on the other hand, if we get some spending done, then actually spending on the infrastructure may not be such a bad idea.
Well, no, you're right. I mean, do we need infrastructure? Absolutely. We need infrastructure, but we need infrastructure that is really infrastructure that's going to drive economic development. So that's why, I hold out the hope that if that occurs, that we have the check, as Brian mentioned, from the Senate, where they'll push for more private involvement, more public-private partnerships, where we'll have a check and a constraint to make sure that infrastructure spending is done in a way that really drives economic development. And when we saw that after the last financial crisis, we didn't see the benefit of a lot of infrastructure and spending that got done that did not drop to financial benefit and economic development benefit for this nation.
Right. Mike, Bernard's point essentially is, the fiscal responsibility has to come from the Senate. Do you agree that the Senate will indeed be the one that will keep us honest here when it comes to fiscal responsible behavior?
Well, I've never been in the business of disagreeing with my boss. So I think
I do every day, Mike.
I think that Bernard is right about the check in the Senate. I will say, though, part of the reason why I'm a little schizophrenic on this poll, because I do think that if with a Democratic Congress, further tax cuts are probably off the table, and so you could see some fiscal restraint there without further tax cuts. So I think from that standpoint, perhaps the pollsters might be headed in the right direction. But that being said, then you look at infrastructure. Now, infrastructure, interestingly enough, has a history of bipartisan support. Steny Hoyer, the majority leader for the Democrats, number 2 in the House, has said on occasion that he looks forward for reaching across the aisle, working with the president on infrastructure. So I don't know. I'm skeptical about what could be done there, but I do think that I could see and envision some sort of deal between Trump and the Democratic House that might have some resonance with the Senate and get something done before the election. I don't think it's. I think it's probably about a 30% chance that'll happen, but I do think it's possible.
So what is then if that's possible and if that's happened, what is then the likelihood of a serious deficit or debt crisis?
Right. So then you would drive up the deficit more, and then you'd have to find places to make up the difference.
Right. Brian, will that find a place to make up the difference if we start spending?
First of all, I don't think that you're going to see lots of new spending. I mean, I think it depends how we define the term fiscal restraint. One way would be thinking about how spending on Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security could be reduced, and the long-term path of the public debt could be reduced. Another is simply to define it as no additional spending and staying on the present course from a spending and debt perspective. I think that second scenario is what's more likely. And I think given that interest rates right now are only in the 3% range, I think there definitely has to be a focus over the long term towards not continuing to escalate the level of spending. But I do think that if the U.S. continues on its present spending trajectory, I do think over time there's a possibility that growth can be strong enough, especially if the right investments are made to make that path a sustainable one.
Okay, let's move beyond fiscal policy, talk about some of the other business relevant policy areas. And again, let's start with our last poll question today that's coming up now, and that is, where do you see the biggest impact from policy change that may emerge from the change in the political landscape that we've seen? So where do you see the biggest impact on business from policy change? In taxes and infrastructure, as we just discussed, but also regulation or trade or healthcare, education, any other area that is haven't mentioned. If that's the case, feel free to put it into the question box. We can take it on board. Where do you see the biggest impact on business, positive or negative, from policy changes? Next 2 years. We'll leave it open a little bit more, because beyond now, and then we're going to close it in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. I'm going to close it. So, again, quite interesting, and Michael, let you start on that in a minute. Actually, 54% is actually saying healthcare is going to be the area where we'll see the biggest impact from what happened last night. 23% says international trade, foreign trade disputes, and how that's all going to work out. Very small group thinks that there will be big changes from this change last night, big impact from regulation or taxes. So Mike, let's start with you here. Healthcare. We didn't talk about it so far. What is the business impact that we might see from healthcare change?
Well, look for a big push. As I mentioned earlier, this House of Representatives now, this new House, dominated by Democrats, came to town and will come to town trying to make a difference in healthcare reform. I don't think much will happen there because of what Bernard suggested, a check in the Senate, and I don't think that the president would sign a bill that the Democrats right now would support. But I do think that becomes then the 2020 issue that Democrats can say that they tried to push towards some of these issues that politically I think might benefit them. So I don't see right now that is really having much of an impact. I think on education policy, the only major piece of legislation is the reauthorization of the Higher Ed Act. And because that act impacts so many young voters who have been voting to the left, Republicans, it might be in their interest politically to basically get that deal off the table, pass it, and not have it become an issue in 2020, because so much of that issue revolves around costs and college education and things like that.
Bernard, you already spoke about regulation a little earlier, so deep dive a little bit more there. We had a fair amount of deregulation. It is helpful, some of it perhaps less so. Where do you think there's still mileage to be made, and what is the chances that this Congress may make that happen? What's the administration?
Well, I think, again, the focus that's been in place from a regulatory climate within Washington over the last 2 years has really been about trying to drive regulatory actions where it really helps to drive the economy forward, right? Just the things that make sense in terms of accessibility for businesses moving forward. So, I think that will continue. I think the climate is very, very strong in the support in the administration, and they have control over that within the executive branch. At the same time, Nancy Pelosi has said, and then the president has been vocal himself about, and it relates to the healthcare issue, about pharmacy, about the costs of prescription drugs, right? So I think we're going to see more regulation in that area around pricing in healthcare and specifically around the pharmaceutical sector. So it'll be interesting to see what it really boils down to is what's going to be the horse trading in Washington. So some things are going to get done. It's just a matter of who's willing to give up on what and who's willing to accept the other side's certain positions.
What is the big regulatory issue that's been left on the table that you think business cares most about?
I still think when we look at it, we're still dealing, from a political standpoint, we're still dealing with this whole area of global warming and how that needs to be dealt with within the United States, right? There's clearly polarization in the country between the red and the blue on that issue, and I think that is going to work its way through in a pretty serious way. How it will end up is anybody's guess.
Are you thinking that's going to work its way through from a legislative standpoint or purely a regulatory standpoint consistent with some of the regulatory changes that the administration has been pursuing over the first 2 years?
I think it's going to work its way through from both perspectives. I think the Democrats are going to be pushing for legislation in one direction, and I think you'll continue to see that the administration will continue to support deregulation as much as possible to get the economy moving.
Brian, we haven't talked about trade disputes, and that's of course another area where the president, in particular, but the administration as a whole, been very vocal. Reduce the trade deficit, create more of a level playing field with China when it comes to technology and everything else. Is last night's election going to make any difference to the direction?
The president's perception, and I am not hearing his remarks at this moment, but my guess is that the president's perception is that his messaging in the closing days of the campaign around trade and immigration and a nationalistic approach on both of those issues worked for him, especially from the perspective of the Senate elections. And so as a result, I think you're going to see continuity with sort of this more direct, more provocative approach on trade, thinking about negotiating bilateral rather than multilateral deals, which will create some issues for business simply because you'll have clauses in different trade agreements that are not interoperable. His view is that by negotiating these bilateral agreements, the U.S. will gain better terms and better leverage. I think in terms of what's been negotiated, specifically the USMCA agreement, that does need congressional approval to go forward. I would anticipate the president will be able to obtain that simply because a lot of the key departure provisions in that agreement from the previous NAFTA agreement, particularly in the auto sector, do enjoy some support, particularly among Democrats from manufacturing states. So I would anticipate that can go forward. I think there are some shared priorities in terms of negotiating trade agreements with China, particularly concerns about technology transfer and data protection. I think both of those areas, I've heard many Democratic senators speak about them as concerns. I think the overall concern is a question of how the president may be redefining the U.S.'s place in the world. A lot of the reason for the construction of multilateral trade frameworks was around sort of a desire to bring greater peace and stability to the world, not simply a desire to improve economic opportunities and the business climate. I think there will be concern on the part of Democrats that the president's current approach on trade represents a clear departure from
that. Mike, there's some people who say that there might be this unintended alliance between the Democrats, particularly the left-wing part of the Democrat president on trade policy. Any chance of that happening, or do you think that's just not?
An alliance? So, Bart, do you mean an alliance between Democrats and business, if you will? Is that what
no, between Democrats and the White House on actually a protectionist trade policy?
Yeah, I think that's unlikely. I think that's possible. I think that certainly the Bernie Williams, I'm a Yankee fan, Bernie Sanders wing of the party, there's a chance for that. But I think they are so angry at this president, I don't see them being in a position to cut any deals or work across the aisle. Again, as I mentioned, there was a moderate wave yesterday that took over the House of Representatives, and I don't see them as being closing the doors. I see them as more pro-trade. So I don't see that as a realistic alliance.
Any other areas in this list of policies that you think stand a chance of being moved forward in it?
Well, obviously, what has to happen is NAFTA has to be renegotiated and passed by the Congress, and I think that will happen, and I think that'll alleviate some of the jitters that people in the business community have about that. So I would think that would be the major thing that I would be concerned about right now, is to get that to happen from a business standpoint. I think they really want that to happen.
Bernard, last point, actually, your comment on climate change and global warming, and that's would need more attention from a regulatory point of view. That actually triggered a question. What you wonders whether a Democratic House could pressure the administration to rethink putting out the Paris Agreement. The president recently said that he actually does believe that climate change is playing a role here. That he's at some point said that he might get back into the Paris Agreement. Is there any chance that there is some movement forward here? Can you deepen it out?
I personally don't think that there's a big chance of that happening. I don't think Congress will be able to pressure this president to do that. That really drives at the very core of the president's base of the message that he has sent all along. Just as trade policy is absolutely critical to his core, just as immigration policy is absolutely critical to his core, I think the Paris Accord was really a signature event very early in his administration to really demonstrate that his intention was to take America and put America first, and that he is tired of deals that are not in the interests of the United States. So I would be very, very surprised that would bring him back to the table on that one.
I think where there's maybe more of an opportunity for movement in terms of economic policy is now that New York State, along with California, have blue governors and blue legislatures. That's going to create the opportunity for some state-level innovation in the climate change space. And I think you're already seeing that on some level in New York State in terms of utility policy. And so I think that's sort of a way forward, not just on climate change, but on many, many issues where states have vastly different philosophies about how to deal with some of these issues. And I think local politics has the opportunity to be, in general, much more constructive, much less heated. and can allow for sort of these opportunities to try out different policy ideas that could eventually make their way up to the federal level and build more of a broad consensus behind them.
No, I think, Brian, you're absolutely right. And I think it's an important point to make, and it's one that we don't have time for here today. But I mean, this election also had some very interesting results at the state and local level, you know, and as we learned long ago from Tip O'Neill, you know, all politics is local, and it's particularly when you get into this regulatory environment. So I think you make some very, very valid points there, and I think it's an area of interest as we go forward. Several states flipped, and there was a message behind all of that, too.
Right. Well, a lot of stuff covered in more than 50 minutes already, so we need to wrap up. But I'm going to ask you one more question, each of you, for just 30 seconds response. I think basically the presidential campaign started this morning, and we have 2 years coming off that. So an obvious question would be who's going to be the next president, but I'm not going to ask you that question. But what I'm going to ask you is, what do you think is going to be the most important business relevant topic that's going to be part of the political campaign in the period to come? What do you think is going to be the hot item that business should care about in the campaign discussion? And Bernard, let me start with you.
You know, as you taught me a while ago, Bart, there are no life cycles in the economy, right? So as a result of that, if you can tell me what's going to happen to the economy in the next year or two, then we'll know. But the bottom line is that, you know, we're coming off a very, very robust economy. The policies that are going to be put in place in the next year and a half are going to have a huge impact in terms of whether this economy cycle continues to ramp up or whether it starts to stall. And I think that's going to have a major influence on where we are 2 years from now.
Brian, what's the big campaign topic?
I think the issue that business should be concerned with, and that hopefully will become an important part of the 2020 discussion, is issues around regulation of new technologies, how competition policy should be shaped given the growth of many important technology companies, and also thinking about issues around data protection. I think those issues are becoming increasingly issues of public concern, particularly based on some of the incidents we've seen over the last year. Unfortunately, I don't think that the 2020 presidential campaign will be a policy-focused campaign. I think you're going to very much see a campaign focused around issues of identity. I think immigration will again be a key talking point, and not in a way that's thinking about, okay, how could immigration policy be changed to help increase future economic growth. I think it's going to be discussed in a fairly divisive way. So I think, unfortunately, what has happened is that both parties after this election are declaring victory, and as a result, you're going to see a lot of the same political environment sort of repeat itself over the next 2 years and into the presidential campaign.
Right. Mike, what is the big campaign rhetoric?
Well, Brian took the words right out of my mouth, but I would add to this that if you're looking at businesses' priorities and what they should be concerned in 2020, it's three issues, and that's trade, and trade. And I think there's an awful lot of jitters that the business community rightfully has about some of this policy, and I think that is what's driving them right now. But I will agree with Brian and the others. I don't see this as like a wedge issue that's not going to decide who the next president is. But if we're asking the question about business and what they should look forward to in 2020, I think you're going to see a real concern in that area.
Excellent. Great comments, Bernard and Mike and Brian, for a morning after to bring all this to the table. It just promises a lot more that will definitely come from the Conference Board and from the Committee for Economic Development. Thank you for joining today. More to come. Just very quickly to wrap up, our regular window on is going to be on Wednesday, 28 November. We're actually going to return to the topic of trade. and specifically talk a little bit about how does China actually respond to this trade dispute. There's a lot about the U.S. response, but how does China respond? And we're going to have some of our China experts with us that day to join us. So do join us 28 November, 2 weeks from today. Here you see some related resources from the conference board, including some China stuff that you can read ahead of time, downloadable for members of the conference board. And then, as always, we'd like to hear from you, both what you thought about this webcast, any comments on how we can improve, but very importantly also topics for future webcasts. We'll take a little break in December, but we'll be back in January with a whole new program for next year. So any topics that you want us to talk about at the conference board or the Committee for Economic Development, please let us know. Again, thanks for joining today. Good luck the next 2 years in this new electoral cycle, but we'll hope we will see you soon again at one of the conference board webcasts. Have a good day.